Welcome to the Tom's River Intermediate North Orchestra concert.
Tonight you will be listening to a variety of pieces played by 6th, 7th, 8th grade orchestra students.
Before the beginning of the concert, we would like to go over a few rules as to not interrupt the performers and audience. Hold all applauses until the end of each piece.
If you need to exit the room, please wait until pieces are over to exit and enter if possible.
Pictures are allowed, however, please turn off your camera flashes. Lastly, please take a moment now and silence your cell phones.
Finally, we would like to welcome to the stage Ryan, Letty, Jill, and Biel to perform Phantom Waltz by Christopher Thomas.
Hey everybody, let's stop talking. Part of what was today is we're working on our opening announcements as a rehearsal, and they're also working on their pieces. So they need to focus, and we'd like you guys and the whole audience to receive the music in its best form. So please don't interrupt the performance. You guys got about 45 minutes of music coming up. So appreciate your patience, and without further ado, Phantom Waltz.
Seasons is one of the most known pieces of repertoire in the classical music genre, featuring 4 movements, each inspired by a different season. This evening, Kaylee Gribb will perform the second movement of the 4 seasons entitled Summer.
With 14 nominations and 6 Oscars, La La Land and its charismatic cast cultivated a new worldwide audience for film musicals, with memorable songs by composer Justin Hurwitz, including Oscar winner City of Stars.
Robert Longspiel's superb arrangement is great entertainment for most any performance. This includes Another Day of Sun, City of Stars, and Mia and Sebastian's theme and audition, The Fools and Fools.
So, before we move on to the 6th grade portion of our concert, I'd like to recognize each of our 8th graders. All right, so over here on the bass we have Kelsey. Sophia on the cello. Letty and Jill on the viola. And our violin section includes Ryan, Kaylee, Sophia, Christina, Scarlett, Trisha, and over there we also have Lila and Zoe as well. We're going to bring the rest of our 8th graders up to finish up the 8th grade portion before moving to the 6th grade portion. We're playing a piece named Danza Latina by Brian Balmages, and it will feature Ryan on the violin. I'm going to wait for the audience to quiet down. I'm asking you guys to develop a little bit more maturity in this concert. We're not at a rock show, otherwise it'd be fine. But you got to understand, these students put over 11,000 minutes of practice into this concert this year alone. All right, that's 43-minute class per day, plus 15 minutes at home, 180-day school year. All right, so please respect their performance and understand these instruments are quiet and we can hear all of you that are speaking. Thank you. So now is going to begin the 6th grade portion of our concert. Each half of the concert has 4 pieces on it. So I'm going to bring up Elsie and Sophia to announce the first piece.
Passage by Ryan Bankston
is a piece that unleashes the energy and excitement of music with its electrifying beginning strings composition that ignites a spark of passion in young musicians.
perfectly scored and has catchy melody that is shared by all sections.
Our next piece features a heroic fan-like main theme and a dreamy secondary theme. This excellent concert opener is a perfect way to make an opening statement.
The low strings will love showing off some power while the upper strings scoring propels the piece forward.
Please enjoy Astro Dreams by Larry Clark.
entitled Terra Nova, which is Latin for New World. From the opening measures to a driving finish, the exceptional work keeps everyone's attention and gives your developing group a new level of maturity.
Featuring a contemporary hip sound, infectious modal, and melodies and changing meter signatures. This also gives every section a chance in the spotlight. Teaching opportunities around as your students explore low finger patterns, B flat and F naturals, dynamic contrast, accents, syncopation, balance, and rhythmic independence.
Our final 6th grade piece is Dragon Hunter, meant to set the dragon on the loose, which is represented in the bass and cello sections.
The medieval sounding effect is created using notes from the D scale, no slurs, and no 16th.
first piece is titled Election Symphonia, composed by Lauren Bernofsky, allowing us to hit the ground running with aggressive lines that contrast with longer, sweeping phrases. The moving lines exchange between each section of the orchestra, giving something fun and fast for each instrument to play. We now present Election Symphonia.
allowing us to hit the ground running with aggressive lines that contrast with longer, sweeping phrases. Up next is Toreador, composed by George Bizet and arranged by Carrie Lane herself. This arrangement from Carmen captures both the opening theme and Toreador's aria, which is initially presented with cello and bass voices. The entire arrangement remains in the key of D, making this quite accessible to young performers while covering some of the most beloved themes from the album.
American rock band Green Day. It first appeared in the third track on the band's second studio album, Kerplunk, in 1991. This arrangement features fast electric-like guitar riffs in the upper strings and fun solo sections for the low strings. Additionally, there is the option to include electric guitar and drums. This arrangement was a creative collaboration between Mr. Urbano and 7th grade cellist Hannah Woodford. Without further ado, please enjoy Welcome to Paradise.
about that? All right, everybody. We got our last piece for you. I'm going to bring up our last announcer to announce it, and that will conclude our show for the day.
This piece is called a dramatic piece that spins a late tale of mayhem and mission. As the rosin-eating zombies take over your stage, complete with blood-curdling screams, glissandos, pompicello, and more. All area effects can be clearly explained and notated, so the only trouble you have is getting your students to stop playing it. It's a wild ride you won't want to miss. We now present rosin-eating zombies from outer space.
Thank you everybody for joining. It's time to go do some work. Have a great rest of your day.